Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Kayla, and you're listening to the Cheat Sheet Speech Podcast, where two pediatric speech language pathologists talk about how to build communication in your everyday routines.
Yes, but before we dive in, just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. If you have concerns about your child's speech and or language, we recommend seeking an evaluation from a speech language pathologist that is licensed in your state.
Perfect. Carrie, what are we chatting about today?
Yeah, so today we're chatting about a situation that we think a lot of parents have been in and can relate to. What to do when you just can't understand what your child is trying to say. So it can be super frustrating for both parents and kids when speech sounds are unclear or hard to follow. So today we're going to talk about some tips and strategies to use as parents for when you can't understand your child.
Exactly. So we will dive into the speech sound milestones, or like when to expect those sounds to develop, a little bit later in the pod. But your child's intelligibility will grow as they develop. So it's likely that they're going to go through a period of time where they are difficult to understand. And just by intelligibility, we mean how well they're understood. And usually we say this by an unfamiliar listener too.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, for the purposes of the chatter portion, we're going to talk about speech therapy strategy. We're not going to talk about those speech therapy strategies, but rather just more how to support your child during this time where they may be difficult to understand, whether that's consistent with as like speech disorder, speech sound disorder, or not, just because that's consistent with their development. So, it could be that they're receiving speech therapy at the same time, or it might just be consistent with that intelligibility development. So, what is our first tip?
Perfect. Let's first start off with something super important. Goes for a lot of parenting, but staying calm and supportive.
Yeah,
When your child's trying to tell you something and you don't get it, that can be very discouraging for them.
exactly. Keep it positive. Instead of saying, I don't understand you, try something like, I really want to know what you're telling me. Can you show me? That will keep the conversation positive, and it just shows you that you care about what they're saying and not how clearly they're saying it.
Right. We want to affirm what they said because that's important, especially as language is developing at these younger ages. They're new communicators. We want them to feel motivated to communicate, especially for our littles who might be more easily discouraged. And then that would maybe make them want to communicate less or have less communicative attempts. So being calm and being supportive is really important.
Yeah. So, tip number two, don't pretend to know what they're saying, right? So, that can also be very discouraging if you go reach for something that's not what they're saying, or you're just kind of ignoring basically what they're saying because you don't know what they're saying and moving on from it. Then you're just not really affirming that communication attempt. Instead, give those two choices. That will help provide context for you as the communication partner so you can have an easier time understanding what the answer might be.
Right. That's going to help set your child up for success. And then you can understand what they're interested in and model that word back to them correctly.
Right. So, like, for example, do you want goldfish or yogurt? By providing those two choices, you have a little bit more context of what they might be trying to say versus what do you want to eat.
Exactly.
All right, Kay. So, what is tip number three?
Okay, number three, I would encourage pairing words with gestures or signs. We can use our body to help with that communication. So pairing the word more with the sign for more. And then when they go to communicate with the communication partner, they might have a better idea of what your child is talking about and what they're trying to communicate because now they're seeing that gesture or sign.
Right, absolutely. So using those gestures just gives kids another tool to communicate. And we love total communication. So that's supporting that as well. And we just want to support any communication attempt. So giving them multiple ways to communicate will help support that.
Exactly. And then you mentioned before asking the child to like show you what they're talking about.
Hmm.
That's a great question if they're asking for something or they're talking about something like in their immediate environment.
Right, but it's not always possible, right? So it
Right.
might not be, the case that they're talking about something that's in the living room or they can like bring you into the bathroom and show you what they're talking about. So if they're talking about, something from school or a friend's name or just something spontaneous, so we just don't have the context there to understand what they might mean, what could we do instead?
So instead, you could say something like, oh, tell me more about it.
Hmm.
Or asking a specific question, not what are you talking about, but is it a toy? What color is it? Think of those questions that are almost as if you're a detective to try to help lead you to what they're talking about.
Yeah, I like that kind of playing a little bit more detective, starting with those questions first before, just saying like, can you try it again? Or I don't know what you're saying type of thing, and
Mhm.
giving up on them, just giving some more options there. So some ideas for when you don't understand your child include staying calm and supportive, encouraging, pairing those gestures or signs with words while they're developing those intelligibility skills, provide two choices, and then just asking more questions, being the investigator so that you can help put those pieces together to figure out what they're saying.
Yes, I think all of those tips are really great to try to figure out what your child is saying. So now let's say you implement some of those tips. You know what your child said. What could you do to now support that speech development and intelligibility?
Yes, that's a good question. So, if we're trying to work on that intelligibility, I would say the first tip sounds kind of obvious, but actually, a lot of people do not do this is model the words back correctly. So, if they say, I like dogs, model back, you like dogs. I like dogs too. This way, the child can hear that correct production. I think sometimes where this falls short is sometimes parents love the cuteness of the incorrect production of something, which it is super cute and fun. If they're using a new word for something, that's totally fine. But if they're dropping some of those sounds in the word, it's really best to just model it back correctly so that they can hear how it's supposed to be said.
Right, leaving the cuteness for them and you're modeling as the adult. And I like how you kept it positive. You didn't say, not dogs, it's dogs. One,
Mm-hmm.
because then you'd be repeating back the incorrect production, but two, because you wanted to make it a positive environment. So you took what they said and you added to it. If your child has been working on that sound, so let's say maybe they are in speech therapy or you notice it
Mm-hmm.
developing, you can then try to give two models. But I would only do this if you know that they're working on it because we don't want
Right.
to be like nagging them about changing their sounds. So if in that case, then you could try is it gog? Do you like gogs or dogs? If they have more awareness of the sound difference.
Right, right. I like how you said that if they're already targeting it, if maybe it's an emerging sound for them, working on it in speech therapy. But if you feel like your child is already frustrated or this communication attempt is maybe associated with something urgent, not the time to provide those two choices. So this, I would try to focus more on just if in a learning environment, something more relaxed, reduced pressure, not necessarily in a communication environment where they're trying to get like a point across type
Right.
situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thinking about that, the appropriate environment to apply the choices strategy. Modeling sometimes it gets undersold because it feels like we aren't like explicitly addressing the skill. We're not telling the child like you need to change this. And we
Mm-hmm.
see that a lot in language development too, but modeling is actually super powerful in both speech and language.
Yeah.
So it's okay if your child doesn't then imitate dogs, for example, back, or if they don't say it correctly. Let's say they attempt, but it's still not correct. Your model is still going to demonstrate what the appropriate motor movements are in order to create that sound.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think we preach this all the time. Model, model, model. there's a time and place for providing that more explicit feedback. And we really just want to keep these communication moments positive. So just trying to seek out those times that you're just focusing on modeling and positivity, and then maybe some of those times if you want to work on some more learning or carrying over those speech targets if your child is in speech therapy. So another way to take that pressure off your child and keep things fun would be for them to guess the correct production in your speech.
Yes, I love that. Do you have an example?
Yeah, so for example, if you're playing a game and the child has difficulty with that g sound, you might say, all right, go when I say go. Let's say we're doing, red light, green light type situation. And then I might say, ready, set, bow. Oh, ready, set, toe. Then ready, set, go. And then waiting for them to hear that word go before they can go. And that will provide just some more auditory feedback of what sounds should be in that word.
You remind me of the kids in gym class, or like even the gym teacher when they're like, ghost.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I always ran.
That makes it super fun and engaging, though, so that your child can start to be aware of the different sounds, again, taking the pressure off them actually saying it. So this would be a little bit more an out of context game to play. So it's not directly after maybe they mispronounce something, but it's like, oh, I noticed they have trouble with this G sound. Let me model it in this way to bring more awareness to them. Speaking of modeling, another way is to model back what you think that they said. So if your child says goggy, you might say, oh, doggy. Yes, the doggy is running. Similar to our example before, but just bringing more attention to that way to produce the word.
Yeah, maybe adding a little bit more emphasis on that word as well versus just like consistently modeling correct sounds, but more specifically making sure that you are repeating back what they said and giving that model in the moment versus just responding to them and always using dog correctly, but in the moment taking what they said, repeating it back correctly so they can really hear it correctly, but more in a relaxed way versus just saying like, you said that wrong, just modeling it back correctly so that you're telling them that correct word without making it an actual like correction of their speech, and just keeping that conversation super natural, like in your example.
Yeah, exactly. Just the key is to keep talking with them and not making it like a drill at them.
And here is the big E, which I think we kind of mentioned at the beginning. Just try not to pretend to understand when you don't. It's totally okay to just be like, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean. Can you show me, or can you tell me more about it? And like, or can, something like that to keep that language positive, but not just assuming that you know what they mean.
Right. And kids pick up on it, honestly, especially if they're trying to like request something or if your reaction to what they said doesn't match. So that can just make them a little bit more frustrated later. And it's better to just work together to figure it out, becomes more of a learning opportunity.
Yeah, another good thing to remember is just to keep that pressure off. When a child feels stressed about being understood, their speech can actually get less clear, right? You're putting a bigger cognitive load on them, increasing that pressure. So that speech could also become less clear. So it's actually counterproductive in that moment.
Yeah, so we just got to keep the communication fun, relaxed, sing songs, read books, talk about what you're doing. Every little bit helps.
Yeah. And now, of course, if your child's speech is really hard to understand, even family members can't understand more of half of what they're saying by around 3-ish, that's a good time to just reach out to a speech language pathologist.
Exactly. Early support can make a huge difference. These are great home tips that we gave you to encourage like a positive communication environment. And just remembering you can use those ones for whether or not they're in therapy, but know that speech language pathologists are there for you. So you can always go in and ask them so that they have a little bit more of a specific idea to your child and can make a better assessment.
Yes, absolutely. These are not to be exclusive of, speech therapy. They're just some great ways to make a positive communication environment, like you said. So that's actually a good segue into our speech spotlight for today, which we are going to talk about that speech sound development. We wanted to just go over those articulation milestones so that you have an idea of what age sounds are acquired.
Mm-hmm. So these milestones are used to help speech language pathologists and families understand what's typical for sound development, and then when we would maybe want to take a closer look at the child's speech.
Yeah, in McLeod and Crow's 2020 review, they looked at when about 90% of children correctly produce each sound at the single word level. These are the norms that most speech language pathologists utilize. So these aren't those early emerging sounds. They represent when most kids have achieved those sounds.
Right. So these milestones are when the child is using the sound consistently.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start with the earliest sounds that we usually hear by around age 2 to 3. What are those sounds?
Yes. So those include, I'll just do it by sound, I guess. So it's p, b, h, w, and d. So a lot of these sounds are produced with the lips. So we would call those bilabial sounds.
Right. Words we're thinking like puppy, baby, mom, no. And then after that, we have the sounds that are mastered between ages 3 and 4. What are those ones?
Yeah, so we would have some more of those back sounds, so k and g and t and f and ing, as in like wing, and y, as in like yes. So you're starting to see some more sounds that are produced in the middle and the back of the mouth and require maybe some tongue tip elevation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we can think words like cat, dog, fun. If your 3-year-old is still working on some of these, that's expected. We start to see more consistency with these sounds towards the end of the 3s, closer to 4.
Yeah, so and then between the ages like 4 to up to even 6 years, we have some more of those sounds, including s, z, ch, and sh, and j, as in like jump, and then that l sound as well, the L.
Good, nice. When we think about speech sounds, we talk about a lot where the sound is produced in the mouth, and we call that the place where the sound is. We also talk about the manner in which the sound is produced, and SLPs call that manner. So we made it pretty simple for ourselves. So is the air stopped? It would be like an example. So are we stopping the air for that manner? And we call those stopping sounds. Or do you have to produce the sound in a continuous motion? We call those ones fricatives. We made that a little bit more complicated than the other terminology. Or is it a mix of both, an affricate? Some of these sounds that Carrie mentioned start to also be more complex, not just like where they are in the mouth, but in how they're produced.
Yeah, it takes a lot of coordination to make all of these speech sounds. So our little ones have to learn a lot of small movements. But then if we're kind of moving up to that, 5 to 6 range, some of those later developing sounds include our R sounds. So like the pre-vocalic R, and then like some vocalic R, like R and or and And then as well, we have like the voice and that like sound or voiceless, and then that zh sound in like measure. I would say R is probably the sound we get asked about most, R and S.
For sure, yes. I think like every time I mention that I'm a speech language pathologist to someone new, they tell me some sort of R story, whether or not they needed to go to speech therapy for R, their uncle did, their cousin did, something. So it's because R, it requires complex movements. It also requires tension, which can be a little bit more difficult for a child to master. And it's also, there's a lot of varieties of how to produce R. Now that's getting maybe a little too speech technical. We can talk about that some other time, but it is one of those later developing sounds. So don't stress about R early on. We can tell you that.
Yeah, don't come to us at 2 with your R's. So PSA. Last, we have that voiceless TH. I think kind of mentioned it, but that voiceless TH is probably the latest developing sound. Again, though, it is good to note that some kids can require some of these later developing sounds earlier, and then some of those earlier developing sounds later. So it's all a mixed batch. So if there's kiddos in your child's preschool class or something, and you're like, they're saying R though, there's a range. And if you look at the chart from the referencing that we had mentioned earlier, the normative data, you'll see it is a range there. And so we're just talking about when 90% of those children have achieved that sound. So there is a range that they can achieve those sounds in. And also, it's really important to note, too, that the speech sound development varies across dialects. So some sounds may differ or not exist in a child's dialect. So that's important to acknowledge. We also make sure that we utilize that information in our assessments as well as speech language pathologists. So dialects also very important. So there are some sounds that are not expected or appropriate for every child to produce as well.
Exactly, yeah. Thinking about what language they're speaking, if they're a second language learner, or if they have a dialect, and being cognizant of that. And so knowing that not all of the speech sounds might apply, or they might have other speech sounds that are within their dialect or the language that they're using. If you are looking for speech sound development in your dialect or language, I recommend going to the American Speech Language Hearing Association website, ASHA, that's our national board, and search for your dialect or the language, because they have a lot of information about what those differences might look like and how language might influence your child's speech or language development, because that can have impacts on the language development piece too.
Right. Like syntax, grammatical markers, things like that as well can all change based on dialect or language, like you had mentioned. So now that we have a reference for when these sounds are achieved, we want to talk about how well a child is typically understood according to our research. So as Kayla mentioned before, that intelligibility piece.
Yes. So in our study by Houston and colleagues in 2021 that we can link, they looked at 38 children between about 2.5 to 10 years old, and they were all typically developing and monolingual English speakers, and they looked at them to determine how intelligibility develops in children. So it's important to know who the population was.
Right. So it might not apply to, specifically, but this is kind of the normative data that we are referencing. So in this study, more than 1,000 adult listeners transcribed what the kids said, so the researchers could measure how many words were understood correctly. They measured those single words and multi-word phrases separately. So that's really interesting because it can show how context affects the intelligibility.
Right. So here's what they found for single words. So this would be no context, just the single words. They found around 50% intelligibility. So like half the time they're understanding a child half the time at around ages 2.5 to 4 years old. Then they found that intelligibility increases to about 75%. So now we're understanding the child 75% of the time, just at the single word level, between ages 4 and 7 years old. And then it gets up to the 90% of the intelligibility. So 90% of the time we're understanding the child, and they're between the ages 7 to 10 years old. Again, yes. All at the single word level.
Yeah. So even in these children who are acquiring these sounds in accordance with that normative data, the speech clarity is still improving well into elementary school. So that's important to remember when parents are worried that their 5-year-old isn't 100% clear yet, that, according to this data, it doesn't have to be true.
Right, exactly. So then now we need to look at those multi-word utterances. So we're thinking like full phrases and sentences. And they found that kids were a little less clear than the single words early on. But by around 4 years old, the multi-word speech actually becomes more intelligible than the single words. So by about 5 to 7 years, these longer utterances were about 90% intelligible to the unfamiliar listeners, where if we go back, that 90% for single words was between 7 to 10. So that context is helping.
Yeah, so the takeaway there, it could be that context helped with the overall intelligibility.
Yes, that's right. And having the context of multiple words that seem to help promote greater intelligibility for these children.
Yeah, another big takeaway from this study for me was just how much variability there was among the kids at the same age. So some 4-year-olds were almost 100% intelligible, where others were close to 50.
Right, exactly. That's what they found in this study, that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a disorder if they have less intelligibility. In order to find that out, we look more at the child's patterns of speech sounds, how stimulable they are in order to produce a sound, meaning like if we give them some feedback as a speech language pathologist, how well they're able to use that feedback to produce the sound. And then also just like, how is it impacting their communication? Is it making it very difficult for them to get their point across?
Yeah. Intelligibility isn't just a number, it's just about how well a child is understood in daily life by people outside the family. So there can be multiple factors that contribute to intelligibility.
Yes. So what does this mean practically for us? We can think by around age 5, we can expect for most kids to be understood about 3/4 of the time by that person that doesn't know them well, like someone, their friend's mom.
Yeah. And so then by the early school years, maybe like 6 or 7, they can be understood most of the time. So, if a substitute teacher comes in, they should be able to understand them most of the time.
Exactly. So if a child's speech is less clear than, let's say, that 3/4 idea that we've just put out there, or you're also seeing like they're really, really frustrated, or they're not talking because no one can understand them, definitely connect with a speech language pathologist licensed in your state.
Yeah, and for clinicians, this study is just a great reminder that intelligibility growth is gradual. So we can use these benchmarks to support realistic goal setting and parent education.
Perfect. Okay, so we can reassure our families that slower clarity growth doesn't always signal a problem, but we can also recognize now some of those ages where we would want to get more support or want to implement some of those strategies at home to support our child to be understood. So we can combine all this information that we just figured out about the speech sound milestones, the intelligibility, and the tips at home in order to provide a really positive and fostering a really great communication environment for our child.
I love that. So that is a wrap on our speech spotlight today. So hopefully that will help guide you with trying to understand what sounds your little one should be producing. So for our communication countdown, we're just going to recap our top 5 strategies to implement when you can't understand your child. So number 1, affirm their communication. I really want to know what you're telling me. Can you show me? Can you tell me more about it? Can you describe it? Number 2, give choices. So if you're, consistently not understanding your child, maybe try switching to giving some choices versus always asking open-ended questions. Number 3, pair with multimodal communication. So use gestures, signs, visuals, just to help promote multiple ways of communicating. So then you can also pair their production with some multimodal communication for more success. Number 4, ask questions, be the investigator. So not asking like open-ended questions, but asking questions that can help you investigate. So being more specific, direct with what you're asking. And last, model. So that will just include modeling consistently the correct productions, and also if they're saying something, taking that and modeling it back so they can hear that correct production right away.
Awesome. And that is a wrap on our Cheat Sheet Speech podcast for today. Please like, subscribe, share with your friend, have your friend share with their friend, and hopefully all of these tips will help your speech and language development journey with your child even better.
Have a good one.
Bye.